right, I hereby call to order the Roseville City Council meeting for Monday, April 17th, 2023. Mr. City Manager, would you call the roll, please?
Councilmember Etten.
Here.
Councilmember Schroeder.
Here.
Councilmember Groff.
Here.
Councilmember Strawn.
Here.
Mayor Rowe.
Here. And with us at the table, we have our City Attorney, Rachel Tierney, who's on my left, closer to me than usual because we're at the table.
It's on the right.
It's on my right, on your left, on my right, yes, exactly. And then City Manager Trudgeon is also here at the table. He's on my left, your right. We also have other staff and guests who will be participating in the meeting as we go forward. Would remind everybody to silence your phones or otherwise assure that they don't disrupt the meeting. And I believe we don't have any members of the public participating remotely this evening.
I'll verify, but that should be correct. That's correct.
All right. Very good. Then the next item on the agenda would be to stand, if you're able, for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Right. Next on our agenda is approval of the agenda, which, being that we have one single item, is probably going to be extremely controversial. Is there a motion to approve the agenda as
So
presented?
moved. Second.
Moved by Councilmember Schroeder, seconded by Councilmember Strawn. Any discussion on that motion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That passes unanimously. We have our agenda for this evening. Next on our agenda is public comment. This is an opportunity for members of the public to speak in general about items related to city business or of interest to people in the community. We will have the opportunity normally during our meetings for people to make public comment on agenda items as those come up, but we do always provide an opportunity at the start of each meeting for general public comment, as I said, on items either related to city business or of interest to the people in the community. Is there anyone here this evening to speak for general public comment? All right, I don't see anyone, so we'll move on then. Next on our agenda then, we get right into business items, and the first item, 7A, is to have a conversation related to our recently initiated classification and compensation study. And we've got our Assistant City Manager, Rebecca Olson, with us this evening to introduce this, as well as to introduce our consultants and get the conversation going with the council. Welcome, Ms. Olson.
Thank you, Mayor. This is just going to be really brief, and then I'm going to turn it over to the experts. As you know, back in the beginning of this year, at February 27th meeting, we approved, or you approved, a contract with ABDO to conduct a compensation and classification study. Since that time, staff has been working with them, looking at our job descriptions, developing our job analysis questionnaire, where we fill out information related to all of our positions. And as part of this process, we have our consultant here this evening. I'll let them introduce themselves. But to talk a little bit about some of the goals of this project, the benefits, what it can and can't do, and then to talk with you a little bit about pay philosophy and where we want to go from here. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Leah and let them introduce themselves.
Thank you, Mayor, Council, City staff. Thank you for inviting us here tonight. It's been fun to work up to this point with the city leadership and department heads. And so excited to be here tonight. This really is for you. So I'm going to go through an agenda tonight that'll hopefully address a lot of the questions that commonly come up, questions, concerns, challenges that come up with these types of studies. But I really want to make sure that you feel that this is a forum for you to answer any of your questions, to talk through concerns you may have or priorities that you have for the study as well, to make sure we're aware of that. And then as Rebecca mentioned, one of the key things we'll be looking for direction from you would be, as we begin to sort of put some of the pieces together in this study, and we'll kind of go through what those are, having a good understanding of what you as a council have in mind for the pay philosophy. So when the market's data all comes back, we'll get a picture of the market. But city leadership gets to decide what is your intentional position within that market. It shouldn't ever sort of boss you around or tell you where you need to be. That's more of a strategic decision that we'd be looking to you for a little bit of direction on. So hopefully that'll kind of come out of today too, so we can begin building some of that as we put the pieces together. So just an agenda for tonight. I'll spend a little time talking and going through some high-level things with you. Very informal, so interrupt. That doesn't bother me at all if you have questions. But I'll try to cover some of the things that I would anticipate would be top of mind for you. We'll go through just a project overview, introduce ourselves. Oh, it's clicking through.
That's me, I'm sorry.
We'll do some
Mind control.
introductions.
Too many mice.
I'll also spend a little time just, I think there's maybe not a misconception, but sometimes historically I've seen cities really sort of underestimate the value and the outcomes of a well-done compensation study. So I want to kind of give you an idea of what you should expect a well-done compensation study plan to give you. We'll go through some of the underlying goals and assumptions that we've been operating under after discussions with city leadership. Kind of go through some of our process and methodology, talk a little bit about how we select comparables for the market study. That tends to be a real area where if we don't sort of have consensus or some alignment at the beginning, it can cause problems at the end, just because people aren't sure where the data came from. So it's nice to get that, get an agreement on the front end there. We'll talk about the scoring. Position scoring is also one of the areas that tends to cause a fair amount of heartburn, both within the organization, and questions come up, it's confusing. So I think that's an area to take a little time to talk about. And then I just want to leave a lot of time for questions and discussion. So, yeah. I think my slides are out of line here. So my name's Leah Davis. I'm a CPA. I'm a partner at Abdo. We are a regional CPA firm, but I lead, so we do all the traditional audit and tax work, but I lead our workforce solutions team, which focuses entirely on people, so employment-related consulting and advisory work. Everything from payroll to Affordable Care Act to strategic HR, and these types of compensation and benefit analysis types of things. Our client base as a firm is well over 30% of our client base is in the public sector, so cities, counties, school districts. But we do work across the not-for-profit and private sector as well. So I think it gives us a little bit of a unique perspective of like the broader market, but also definitely a specialization in the public sector as well. I'm joined here today by Michael Mooney. He's a senior associate on our team and helps a lot with is very, very involved in the studies, particularly on the analytical side and the data analysis and compensation work. And then Brittany Bauer, who's not with us tonight, another senior associate, and she does a lot of work on the position scoring, job descriptions, more of the HR focused pieces of the study. All right. So a little bit just on where we're at and the different phases of the project. As Rebecca said, we kicked the project off maybe a month ago, I believe. So we're through sort of the initial data gathering. There was a big lift for city staff. It's a long list of things we sort of asked them to download on us, but they were really quick to turn that around. We're sort of in the process of doing job descriptions for every position within the city. So I think it's actually closer to 106 positions. That's the area where there's a lot of involvement from city staff, all the way down to the position incumbent level. So Michael did training with the department heads to really help them understand what the process is for gathering that job description information. We use a tool called the Job Analysis Questionnaire that Rebecca referenced. So we taught them to use that and also gave them the tools to make sure that their employees, who they were going to be asking to fill out this questionnaire, understood why it was really important that they take the time and do a good job. Job descriptions are foundational to any of these studies. When you're trying to match jobs to the market, when you're trying to assign position scores to the jobs, if those aren't correct, things bubble up. They don't land right. So we had really great participation in that process, and so now our team's in the process of taking those completed questionnaires and redrafting updated job descriptions. So that's a big project. As we do that, we're doing position scoring. So as we get sort of drafted job descriptions, they're going back to city leadership for review. And we're also taking a first run at that position scoring, as well as doing some like testing and review related to FLSA status, exempt, non-exempt, are we staying out of trouble in any of sort of the reasonable accommodation language, those types of things that you would see in a job description. So any questions on the job description process sort of in the works. So our goal to have job descriptions in draft form to city leadership would be by the end of the first week in May. There's some back and forth going on right now just to make sure that drafts are meeting expectations with leadership and aligning with the questionnaires, but so far so good. So the next phases though that will be coming, so once that's completed and they overlap a bit, but we'll be working on developing what is that list of comparables. So we'll talk through that list or that discussion tonight, or how we kind of go into that analysis. And then we'll go out to market. Typically, a lot of the data would come from the League of Minnesota Cities, does an annual salary survey. They are not doing that for 2023, so we'll be soliciting directly from any of the cities that are selected for the study. So we'll be getting it straight from them. They're not required to provide it necessarily, but we do try to incentivize them with some high-level summary data. If you show us yours, we'll show you ours a little bit. And right now, because the league data is not out there, we've been pretty successful this year because people don't have anywhere else to get information. So,
And on that point, we've also been getting a lot of requests to participate, and so we've been reciprocating of filling out theirs so that maybe they will fill out ours.
And we do have the 2022 league data as an export, so we've been able to utilize that, just filling in gaps if we are missing responses from certain surveys, or if we need to kind of broaden our search a little bit, we can age that data as well.
yeah. So, and then there are some positions that may have a reasonable private sector comparable, and so we're identifying those as well. We have access to the most recognized national resource for private sector compensation data. So there's instances where in certain departments there may be quite a bit of private sector market pressure. Where we're seeing it a lot is in like cities that have electric utilities, even accounting and finance positions in some cases. So that will be considered too if it seems relevant and we have access to that data. One component that we'll be taking a look at too, because it was an area that the city wanted to take a look at, was that seasonal employee compensation structure. So we'll be kind of touching on that. And then another, as we kind of pull all of that together, we're meeting with leadership a couple different points. So we'll be meeting with department heads once we kind of get a draft of those position scores done, because that's where a lot of questions come up and we want to make sure that they sort of understand how the project is moving forward. They also know the positions better than we do, so if something's not right, that's usually where it'll bubble up and we can work through it. And then we'll also be circling back with city leadership when we get to sort of here's what the preliminary market data is telling us. Then there's an implementation cost analysis, so whatever that market data says, and then trying to align with your desired market position will help you get a really good understanding of what that looks like from a budget perspective. And if it's more than budgeted for, what might some phase-ins over a year or two look like, so we'll help you with all of that. And then final report and presentation to the council so that you can have good final numbers going into budget approval season. Okay. So, very high level, why do a compensation study? I know it's been a bit since the city has done a full project. And really, a well-done compensation plan should last 5 to 7 years if well maintained. So the last couple years, I think, have really motivated a lot of cities to take another look, though, because the market has moved in a way that is sort of unprecedented as far as my memory serves me. So, but not only figuring out, well, what should we pay people, but a good compensation study, you should end up with updated, current, compliant job descriptions, which you'll have at the end. Those are used for a wide variety of important things across the organization. You know, work comp, light duty, reasonable accommodation requests. So there's a wide variety of important regulatory reasons to have updated job descriptions, and so those are important. That's a good objective. The position scoring and classification is a key component in your tri-annual Minnesota pay equity reporting. So having good scores that align with accurate job descriptions that sort of are tied to your compensation model is an important piece of making sure that you're compliant. So that's important. That intentional labor market positioning. This was easier to do, but I think in the last few years, a lot of cities are feeling like they're sort of throwing darts at the wall, and so being able to sort of get your arms around, okay, what has moved on us, where are we today, how that even impacts some of your independently negotiated union agreements, trying to get all those pieces to fit together in some ways important. And then a well-done compensation study should be motivating from a performance perspective, even if they're not, you know, solely performance-based steps within your model. They need to work together. So if they run completely independently of one another, the compensation's not motivating the performance in some way, that can be a challenge for cities. So making sure they're at least cohesive, if not interdependent. So we talked about pay equity. I think another important thing that should come out of a compensation study, and we've talked about this too, is having a clear policy about, okay, we just rescored the position, it placed in this grade with this pay range. What happens when an employee says, that's not right? My score's not right. My job has changed. Having a clear policy about when reclassification might happen, how to make a request, who can make a request, how frequently that can be done, and provide some clarity for employees about, well, what kind of job change might impact my score, and helping supervisors understand that as well. So, all right. And then just having, when we talk about that compensation philosophy, what is that plan or intention as far as longevity and or exceptional service pay? Some cities do that in addition to their ranges, some don't. There's no right or wrong answer, but it's whatever you do, it should be on purpose, I guess is the main thing there. So some of the things that we are assuming as we move through the project. One, that the city of Roseville is highly motivated to be seen as an employer of choice. I've heard several times that you'd like to be a destination city, not somewhere where employees start because they're hoping to end up somewhere else, but somewhere where you can attract the top talent to make sure you're meeting the needs of your residents, right? And particularly in the current labor market, it's really, really critical. Historically, you've aimed to position yourself in that 97 to 100% of market, which would be average. So if we say 100% is average, you're wanting to stay sort of right there, maybe just below. There's always a variance. You can't get every position exactly at market, but to stay very, very close. So that's still important for a variety of reasons. That updating that formalized pay structure across the whole organization is important for compliance, for pay equity reasons, to meet some of those recruiting and retention demands. Another important piece too is related to being more realistic about what skills and experience, particularly educational experience, is actually necessary for each positions, and how can you as a city be compensating people for the skills that they bring that aren't necessarily entirely dependent on post-secondary education or those types of things. It's more of a potential and capabilities conversation as opposed to bachelor's degrees. And again, where it's appropriate, right? Some positions require licenses. Your police officers have to have a post license. But where we can make sure we're expanding that network for you, both for recruiting and, again, to make sure you're working towards your diversity inclusion goals as a city.
Can I just ask a question about
yeah.
that? Is it important in those cases to have really good metrics to be able to sort of get the cross comparison between equivalent education and equivalent other skills, to make sure that you're really sort of fairly analyzing it, or you're not automatically sort of excluding somebody, because it would seem to me, sort of as an outsider, that is important.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we start, here's human nature. whoever fills out the job analysis questionnaire is going to put the knowledge, skills, and experience that they have as the minimum requirement, right? So if they have a bachelor's degree, they are going to put, whoever would replace me would need a bachelor's degree. That's just human nature. One part of the training, when Michael went through with the department heads, is always, but we need to ask ourselves, department heads are reviewing everything that comes up through. If you were going to replace that position, what is the minimum education that you would say, I can't even interview someone without this education or experience? Because if we would interview someone who maybe had an associate's degree and relevant experience, or demonstratable skills in a certain area, then that's not actually, then a bachelor's isn't actually the minimum requirement for that position. So it's just getting more honest, I think, about what is actually required versus preferred. And we poke at that a little bit as those job descriptions come back. They do sort of bubble up during the position scoring a lot of times, because if someone over demands in it's a heavily weighted area in the scoring. So if they're over reporting the educational requirements, those positions will score out wrong. They'll come up higher than positions, and sort of when it's on paper, I think everybody can kind of admit, okay, that's maybe not correct. So I do think too, the current labor market has made people more flexible. In reality, they're open to interviewing more candidates, and being more open to other sort of non-traditional experiences and skills. So that answer, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's just a matter of making sure that sort of we build it into our system, that we're not artificially excluding people, and wanting to make sure that the sort of the requirements we advertise or all those types of things, are really what we are looking for, and so I just want to make sure that sort of, that we have the system as an organization to make sure that it actually works the way it's supposed to, I guess is what I'm thinking.
Yeah. Did you have a comment too?
I just wanted to say educational achievement has not been proven to be a predictor of job success. There are many other things that are.
Oh, right, and that's what I'm saying. I just want to make
Yeah.
sure that we're not.
But a combination of education experience in a certain area or something like that would be, I just wanted to comment too that the educational inflation is very real. And so I don't know if these metrics are correct, but I think that like a manufacturing supervisor, like 68% of the postings said you had to have a bachelor's degree, but only like 17% of the people they surveyed did. So just to be realistic about that educational experience, I mean, I don't know, I don't remember much that I learned in college, so, but in my master's degree, then of course I'd be more relevant, but.
Yeah, most definitely. My answer to your question would be the job descriptions are intended to capture that, and we are definitely attentive to that as we're going through those job descriptions. As far as making it work, it needs to be a combination of, the job description is sort of a baseline, but understanding what to interview. If not those sort of objective metrics, I think it's your HR team is working really hard on making sure they understand, well, if that's not something we're going to rely on, which I think is accurate, how do we actually screen for the skills that do matter in our recruiting and interview process, right? And a lot of times they're soft skills. So really sort of flipping the recruiting and interviewing process on its head and getting really smart about what kinds of behavioral questions can we ask in an interview that help us understand if they have these sort of intangible things that we need. So it's a little more comprehensive than the compensation study.
No, that's exactly the kind of thing I was wondering about, so I appreciate you getting at that.
It's a great question. And then one thing that's just really important to understand, we're including all of your collectively bargained employees in the study. You need to know where the market is at for those employees. They need to be scored. They need accurate job descriptions. But just know that when we get to the point where we're recommending a not necessarily step and grade, but when we're recommending a compensation model, they will not be included. So it'd be your organized employees would be included in that model, but you'll have good information as you go into negotiations with all of your unions. So just important to keep that in mind. When we're doing testing, for example, pay equity testing though, they're of course included in their current agreement. So we're making sure that if you put all of them together in that testing, it would still be compliant. So, any questions on that? Okay. All right. We talked about the League of where do we get our data and how do we go about a study. So I've talked through, we rely heavily on League of Minnesota. We'll age that 2022 data if we need to, but a lot of it hopefully will come from direct surveys to the cities that we've deemed good comparables, and then Economic Research Institute is that well-respected private sector database that we'll use where it makes sense. Important thing to note, we don't see other city job descriptions. So we're doing our very best to match job titles. And again, in similarly positioned and sized cities, a lot of job titles match. I mean, this positions are somewhat similar at times. There's always some of those outliers. But we do our best to sort of blend the data as it makes sense. And but we never get to set your job description next to the other city's job description. So sometimes it's just important to know that coming out, what is the market data and what isn't it. And we also, when we go to the market, we're looking at ranges. So sometimes providers will just take an average, like here's the average for the position, and then they sort of fake range. They'll just math out a range. We actually, what is the minimum for each position? What is the maximum? And we're looking for the market minimum and maximum for each position and establishing a market-driven range. So that's kind of where we're going there. When we talk about, well, who is a comparable, that's how we look at the data, but how do we decide who is a good comparable for the city of Roseville? There's really sort of two-tier of criteria. So we're looking at population is a big one, as is proximity to the Minneapolis-St. Paul metro, right? So for Roseville, we're looking, my initial run, we're looking at cities with 25 to 45,000 population, most likely, in that 7-county metro area. We want to make sure that all of your departmental, operational functions are represented. We want at least 3 data points for each position for it to, it's not real great market data if you only have 1 data point, right? So looking for that. And then again, is there any private sector transferability? So do we have comparables that are just very clear matches to 1 or 2 positions? The second tier criteria that we definitely consider. Oh, do you have a question?
No.
Oh, sorry. Second tier, we're also really looking at budget. Is the budget relevant? Because that can be very different even with a very similar population or geographic location. Population demographics. So focusing more on is there some relevance in sort of race and age demographics in that area? We're looking at regional retail. So, for example, retail sales per capita is a number that we're sort of tracking, or at least want to have an eye on to make sure that we're not really out in left field. Median household income is one to keep in mind. And then this is less objective, but I think there is just sort of a general sense in the area of a destination versus a stepping stone community, and making sure that we're comparing apples to apples in that regard. Another important thing to keep in mind too is you may have, let's say for example, there is something very unique about your fire department where, we may establish these are your 8 cities that are very comparable, but maybe their fire department is really only comparable in 2, and they're more comparable to these other cities that wouldn't be included for the rest of the positions. We're gonna go out and solicit enough data points for relevant. And it may be that we only use the fire department for that outside city, right? But just to make sure we're doing a good job there. And again, getting 3 or more data points is ideal. Hopefully we have 8 to 10, right? This is a really important area to stop and make sure that if you have questions, concerns, I think this tends to be an area where if cities have had compensation studies in the past, there's maybe lingering trauma, maybe is the word, or it tends to cause the most heartache at the end of a study if it's not right. So I would just like to get feedback, comments, questions on this piece.
Jump in.
Do you have a pre-started list of those comparables?
I have pulled down some information, and we're kind of working on finalizing it. Yep. I know Rebecca's been getting input from union representatives, so we're trying to sort of compile a lot of it. But yes, we have a very good start on it, but I don't know that it's anything I'd be ready to throw out yet.
So just for some background, we do have a list of cities that we've historically used, particularly through this past compensation study that was done in 2013, as well as for some of our union negotiations. So we do have those cities that we've provided to Leah that will, we can narrow those down how it looks. But really the focus is on what criteria do we want to use to find those comparable cities.
Sometimes the nice part as a consultant is I can come in with blind eyes. So I'm going out and saying, well, if you didn't have historical comparables, who do I think would be someone you should consider? And so that's where we've gotten, is here would be my first run. Mm-hmm. And so now we're going to sit down and kind of compare notes a little bit. So.
I was just curious, this is new to me in this realm, but I'm in HR otherwise,
Yep.
and in the middle of a comp study for a nonprofit. So why is it that we don't utilize county, state, or other public entities in the comparable study? And then I just wanted to add that I appreciate coming in with blind, because otherwise it feels like it could be an artificial, the top 10, they always compare it against each other and they just keep ratcheting each other up. So it feels like it's good to make sure that we're not having a predisposed set of comps in that.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. Your question about like other public entities, there's a couple different, one, school districts don't report. So if we're looking at like school districts, they don't report the same way as cities. There has historically been good participation from counties in the League of Minnesota Cities study, for example. But there's also, the jobs don't usually match up all that well. In my experience, also county hourly pay, so like when you're looking at benefits, there's the total comp that we have to kind of keep in mind here too, but a lot of times that base pay in a county setting tends to almost be a little lower than in a city setting. And so it can skew the data a little bit to include too much of that county data. So we can include it where it really makes sense, and we will, if that makes sense.
I just know a lot of state jobs would come in a lot lower.
Yes. So we're careful. Sometimes it makes sense and sometimes it doesn't.
Okay.
I was wondering, when you're talking about comparison, are you including all the other benefits as well when you're doing a comparative?
Yeah, so we will be soliciting, through the survey, we'll be soliciting some benefit information, whatever they can provide. What is important to note, though, is that is much more difficult to quantify in terms of, well, what is the market and are we average? You can't always assign a number to a benefit that then you can compare to one another, right? So we could even say, any of the cities you're comparing to are going to be a large group. They're going to be underwritten for medical insurance. So for example, you may compare yourself to the city next door and they also pay 100% of employee premium. I'm just throwing out numbers here. 100% of employee premium and 20% of family premium on a health insurance plan. But there's no dollar for dollar comparison of that because your claims history may mean your rates are 50% higher than theirs. So what we do is we put together a matrix for you that basically says, here's what you're offering, and then by benefit type, what's your contribution to an HSA, for
Right.
example, compared to these cities? What's your premium share for these different types of benefits compared to the other cities? The one area that is, that we're seeing a lot more, that we can get a little more comparative data is paid time off. It's easy to count days or hours for those types of things, and to get a good understanding of, you know, at what point does a person have X number of hours or those types of things. So we'll get at some of that, but it's not going to, base pay is what's driving the compensation structure. And then you can use that benefit data to sort of figure out the total comp picture, but they don't.
Well, and a lot of times the other benefits can be an attraction for people
Yes.
to, and when you're looking at, you know, where do you want to be in a pay range is one thing, but then if you're also attractive because of these other things like family leave and some of
Yes.
these other things that we've incorporated, so, you know, those are also pieces that have to be considered when you're trying to figure out, are we trying to attract talent? It's, yes, pay is very important,
Yep.
but there's these other pieces that we want to make sure and sell, and then also make sure we're comparing what other people have, you know, is that making them more attractive than us because we are missing a policy that might be. So that's, I guess, what I'm
Right.
looking at.
Yes, yeah, if you weren't, you know, covering health insurance in a way that was comparable at all to other cities,
Yeah, that's a
that's gonna be a
given.
challenge,
Yeah,
right?
right.
So we can give you an idea of, are you in the game on
Yes.
those things? But as far as like a, you know, your total comp dollars for this position is this compared to this city is this, those are figures we could give them to you, but I don't think they'd mean the same thing in a lot of sense.
Well, typically, that's more for internal budgeting when you're doing the dollars amount. I'm more interested in the policy side
Yes.
of it.
Yeah, we'll get details of like,
Yeah, because you want to be able to know the dollar amounts for the budget, you know, so if you're looking at where we at, you know, can we afford this? You have to include all the benefits of what we're doing.
yes.
Yeah, yeah, thank you.
Yep.
I was just curious, are most of the insurance plans for the cities self-insured? Or are we going out to the marketplace? And we're just wondering if we're comparing a platinum to a bronze or, you know, other levels in the ACA, making sure we're comparing.
That way, yeah. We ask for information about the plans offered, right? So a lot of times you'll get back, oh, comparable city has an HSA compatible plan and, you know, a typical PPO plan, and here's what they cover for premium share for each different type of plan, and here's the HSA match if you go with the HSA plan. So we do get levels of plans and information about, again, high level. What are they offering?
I just know it can be helpful with the ACA. You definitely get an idea of a platinum versus a bronze, you know, what kind of coverage and what kind of benefits an employee has, but I'm not sure if it's self-insured, if you're gonna be able to quantify it that way.
Yeah, it gets a little tricky. Well, and even if they're not self-insured, they're all underwritten. So, but yes, I'll add that. I know we always get the plan details, but maybe that designation would be a good comparable.
I wanted to get back to the comparable cities part of it. And you had mentioned a range of, I think it was like 20 to 45,000 or 25,000 to 45,000 population. And I wondered, you know, is it appropriate to exclude some of those larger cities? Is it being done because they are sort of up here in the ranges of compensation because they're even more of a destination than we are? That's sort of the next step from us as a mid-sized? Or can we get valuable information from cities like, you know, St. Louis Park, Edina, Coon Rapids, Blaine, that are bigger than us, but in a lot of ways maybe seem to on the surface have more in common with us than we might think, just because we've, you know, looked at the population and they're so much bigger. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that, because that may also expand the ability to make sure we have 3+ data points. If we're
Yes.
starting to look at some of the larger cities, they also will probably tend to have more varieties of positions that may more closely match with ours too. So I wanted to I wanted to see if it made sense to start looking at expanding the range of population upwards a little bit. Clearly, I think, Bloomington may be a little different than Roseville and a lot of these other cities, and they're about 90,000. And clearly we probably wouldn't look at Minneapolis and St. Paul because of a whole host of reasons that those are quite different, and we've already talked about metro versus outstate. But I think there's some metro area cities that are larger than Roseville that I think we might want to add to the mix, as long as we don't think it's going to sort of artificially skew things one way or the other. And maybe that's something where you have to look at a variety of cities. I mean, one could assume that Edina pays more than other cities just because of the reputation of Edina as a high-end place, but that may or may not be the case. But I mean, you also can understand that, maybe that large cities just in general do pay more or something like that might skew the information. So wanted to get your thoughts in that regard too.
Yeah. No, did you have a comment?
I'll let you answer first, but
Okay.
I have an observation as well.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. And the answer is yes, that's a conversation we should have, right? So the first run we take is, who are your clear the unarguable comparables, right? That being said, most cities have a next door neighbor who may be much larger than them, who for a lot of positions is still a competitor from a labor perspective, right? So some positions, I'll pick on you, Pat. So a city manager, a city administrator at a 30,000 versus a 90,000 population city, those are very different jobs. But your public works maintenance worker one is not that much of a different job in a 30,000 and a 90,000. So a lot of times what we're seeing clients do is say, we know that they might not be a comparable, an obvious comparable, but we do feel they are a competitor from a labor perspective. And so we want the data, and we'll be transparent about where it's included. So a lot of times what we've been doing is we'll show you the market data a couple ways if you elect to pull in some more of those cities, which I don't think is wrong to do. So you pull them in and you say, okay, if we average everybody, the big one, the comparables in the larger cities, what does that market data look like and where are we positioned? If we pull out the larger cities, what impact does that make? If we just compare to the larger cities, so you can kind of get a feel for what is the impact. Sometimes there is a point in city size where it's not as impactful. There's sort of a diminishing impact as you get larger and larger. So they may be more comparable than we think.
Sure. Well, and I think that was the thing I was getting at was, I completely understand excluding smaller cities, because you start to get to a point where, either the same person's wearing several hats, and so how do you even compare it? Or they have, such a small staff that they don't, they farm out certain functions and things like that. So very much more difficult. So I completely get that. But sometimes, like you're saying, just at the very end there, the larger cities, in a lot of cases, other than the city manager piece, can have a lot of positions that are quite common. So that's why I wanted to make sure we weren't sort of artificially excluding those. Understanding, once again, the city manager part is just, so much different in big cities, and that's why Pat is looking to move on to a bigger city from Roseville at some point.
The city wants to work more.
And really any leadership position, you get in a 3x size city, then any leader, the scope of leadership becomes very, very different. So that's where you need to be a little more careful in the comparables, because they can really be different jobs. The budget, everything is very different. But yeah, a lot of your sort of entry or non-supervisory positions, sometimes they are.
Well, definitely, most of the 160 job descriptions that we have in Roseville probably aren't in the leadership part.
Yeah. And even in the leadership roles, I think it's good to know. Where those ranges are in those other cities as well. So,
Mr. Mayor, I was just going to say, in relation to your conversation about populations and maybe looking at some bigger cities, for all the reasons we just talked about. But I think one thing I mentioned in my budget message is that we are a very busy city during the daytime. So daytime population versus nighttime population. The amount of jobs, 30,000 jobs, people coming shopping, makes us a much more complex city than a typical 35,000 person city nighttime population. And as a result, you have more complexity to the things that we do. As the council knows, we have to talk about a lot of complex things because of our uniqueness here. So there probably is some merit in looking at some other cities, certainly with the caveats that Leah brought forward that, it may not be an apples to apples for every position, but I think there is probably some merit to talk about it in that way, not just to say, well, nighttime population is going to be it. There are some other factors as well. We list a whole bunch of other ones, so I just wanted
Right,
to.
and in a number of the cities that I mentioned also do have, regional malls or
Yep.
equivalent large, draws of employees and things like that. So I definitely think that that tends to seem to concur with the viewpoint of looking at more than just the population on the census information.
I just wondered too, if we're looking at comparable cities, if we're looking at city structure like a Plan B city or other items like that, where.
Oh, yes, that's being considered as well. I think we had, there's a criteria that we were looking through,
All right,
making
thanks.
sure that operationally they're similar, yeah.
It's, even with the different types of city plans between A, B, or statutory, there's below sort of the council and management level, a lot of it is quite similar, it would seem, just from what I've observed over the years and looking at and interacting with people in other cities. But definitely at a certain level that stops, yeah.
Yeah. Questions? Anything else? Okay.
Could I ask, so using the criteria listed here, we can come up with a list of comparable cities, and we can certainly share that with you. We don't want to get too far down the road if we produce a study and everybody says these comparable cities aren't the cities we want, but we're really trying to base it on criteria versus just a feel. I think this city should be in this because I think it's close to us without really any analysis. So we'll try to do that analysis because we really want to get past that point so we all agree that this is comparable cities, and we've already noted the variety and the variance we're going to have with all different types of city. There's not going to be one perfect data point, but if we can come together and agree on that, then that's going to make the next conversations much more fruitful, I think, and just focus on, okay, what's the impact? How are we going to do it? How are we going to implement it? What's the timeline of those things? I just want to make sure we don't get stuck down at the lower level of arguing about cities and not having some consensus. And so we could bring something back at a future date and say, here's where we're at, and let's have the conversation. And here's why we pick these based on these criteria. And so we want you to know that we're not just picking them random too. We're not cherry picking cities from our perspective. We're trying to have some criteria. And so the conversation tonight has been helpful. And if there's any other input data that you think you want us to consider, we'd love to hear it as well.
Sure. Well, maybe one additional data point or response or piece of information in the process. One argument could be is that the more cities you include, the better, because you're spreading your net wider and getting more information. Obviously, there's two impacts. One is, more work for our consultant and staff. We don't necessarily want to just artificially create more work for everybody. But then the other piece of it is, sort of diminishing return. Once you get to a certain number of comparable cities, you're just kind of repeating the same data over again. But I think my general thought is the more you can kind of start with, the better. And then, if you see a lot of similarities, you can sort of say, okay, we don't need to consider all 20 of these or all 50 of these or whatever the number is. We can start to maybe whittle that down just to make the process of processing the data and surveying the cities and all that easier too. But if that's a step that it makes sense to kind of bring back to the council for some feedback in the middle of the process, that might be something we could do as well. If you want to get some more feedback to make sure that you're on the right track with the council, because I do know that was kind of a sticking point with the past compensation study. That was probably some of the trauma that was mentioned earlier. Councilman Burkhardt.
Yeah, but I would reiterate some of what you're saying. In my day job, I do comparables all the time, in a different way entirely, because it's housing. But we do the same thing. We look for data points. We look for our criteria, different year built, things like that, square footage. But usually when there are outliers, that's what I do in my job, is drop out the outliers, because there's a reason that happens if they're way on one end or the other. But I'm very curious to see how the information comes out. But I think the process makes total sense to me.
Good,
So.
good. Is it something, because I agree, if you're saying like, let's expand it a little bit, then typically my recommendation would be to use sort of a funnel method. So we've said, okay, yes, we have agreement, before we even know the answers, we have agreement on sort of the criteria, it sounds like. I started with a pretty narrow, our first sort of who are our obvious comparables. That's a pretty narrow population range, that 25 to 45. So my question would be, if we're gonna expand that a little bit, and I can come in objectively and just say, then who fits in there, and then let's apply our criteria. What's a population range, without naming cities, right? What, in your mind, seems reasonable to take that up to?
There's
Rebecca has an
probably, there's probably 10 to 15 cities on the list I'm looking at that are between 45 and 90,000 that are in the metro area that aren't Bloomington. So that would add 10 to 15. And once again, the only reason I excluded Bloomington is because they've got the Mall of America. You know, we have a mall too, but I just think that that's, and Bloomington does some health services and things like that just seems like they're just kind of a notch above the rest of the cities that are otherwise comparable. So I wasn't singling out Bloomington because I don't like them or anything like
Yes.
that. But so that's kind of a number, and I you know, obviously 10 to 15 could be huge in one reaction, or it could be, oh, that's no big deal, depending on your perspective. So that just puts a number out there that, you know, can be responded to in one way or another. And Rebecca, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
Any thoughts on that?
I would just offer that I think that range is big, but I think that some of the cities that might be competitors, that might be where we have some overlap, would be up to, you know, the 75,000 population. It's what we've seen a little bit when we've done our annual, using the league study to look at different positions. So that's not a set number, but I'll just throwing out like a 70, up to 75,000 could be potentially some of our competitors.
That only eliminates 3 from this list. So.
Good with that?
That feels really, I mean, if you were asking me what I would recommend, that feels really realistic. You get up to in the more than 2x, and I think that just gets a little bit tough sometimes.
Yep.
But yeah, I think up to that 75 is probably a good one.
I think going down is tricky too, though.
Going down too far is tricky, so I wouldn't go down more
No.
than 25,000.
Because my experience is they just don't have the services.
Well, and I think the sort of scope of experience and oversight, particularly at a leadership level, it starts to get really tough for it to be comparable.
Well, their fire departments and their police departments and their park departments are very different.
The call volumes,
Yeah.
Levels of service. And,
yeah.
and I think a lot of times those smaller cities tend to be the entry-level cities for a lot of jobs across the spectrum
Yep.
that then people graduate up to the bigger cities.
Yes. I agree. Okay, so we'll just open that up a little bit.
I was going to say, if we're going up as high as 75, I really would want to make sure we're tying it back to some of these other pieces.
The other criteria.
Yeah.
The first
Yeah.
tier,
'Cause you could weed
or
out some that don't
population,
match,
age
right.
percentages, and one of the big things that's driving, say, our fire department's busyness is some of our age spectrum right now, as they're providing health services a lot of times. So thinking about not just saying 75,000, but 75, and they've got these other 2 or 3 important things that are in common.
Yes.
Does it make sense to look at like percent single-family versus multifamily housing or that kind of thing?
Is that captured in median household income in some ways?
Not necessarily.
Not
Because
necessarily.
Multifamily versus,
we've got some
No.
fairly expensive multifamily
Well, and also,
and some very inexpensive multifamily.
yeah, we have a lot of seniors who are in,
And single-family homes that aren't very, you know,
yeah.
high price either, so.
This is kind of repeating, but the other aspect of that is what the daytime population is, because
Yep.
not all of these cities we're looking at have a
Yeah.
doubling of daytime population.
There should be data out there about the
Yeah. I'm sure
net job
there is.
in and out and things like that, because I've seen that comparison done.
Okay. So one of the conversations that we had too, that's just important to sort of throw out there, and we can talk through this if it's, I think it's good to look at all of those criteria. When we get to the end of the day, you're gonna have a situation though, and we'll probably we will make recommendations. But what always ends up happening is well, they're a really good match for this criteria, but not that
Yeah.
criteria.
Yeah, of
So,
course.
right, so we can add a lot of things, but it is important to stay more focused than probably you want to, because pretty soon you start having, and then it's measuring, well, which criteria matters more
Yeah.
than others. So, yeah, I'm 100% open to considering more criteria, but just make sure you're thinking.
Well, I think
that.
if you were getting at the number of like fire calls or emergency medical calls, I think that age demographic probably covers that better than single family versus multifamily,
Yes.
now that I think about it. So you might not have to look at that,
Yeah.
that housing criteria then.
Well, and one thing to consider is that kind of criteria is very specific to our union, which is kind of pulled out from a lot of this
Yeah,
as
Good
well.
point, good point,
So-
yeah.
So, yeah, I think it sounds to me like we're sort of all on the same page about how to approach the list, and we'll expand it out and go from there.
And I think as it comes back to us, if it's well described how the list was ultimately arrived at,
Yes. Right.
and how the criteria were used, and, you know,
Yep.
what kind of ranges people or cities fell into, then, you know, then we should be able to be comfortable with it, hopefully. And if not, we have a reason to explain why we're not comfortable with it.
Exactly, okay. I'll just make sure there's some good detail in the report, because if you're wondering, any other reader of the report will too. Okay. All right. Okay, last, and I have as much time as you need, so, but if you're like, that's enough, we need to go. Let me know.
We got till 10.
The other big area that's important to talk through is the scoring methodology. So this is, how do we sort of establish the ascending order of scores to these positions, right? So one of the things, we'll kind of go through our methodology. One of the things to just know as I go into this is we spend the time to talk through this with your department heads. Employees are going to get frustrated about this. It's confusing. The score means something very personal to people, even though the score is based on the position and never the person, but it's what they get up and do every day. So it's very personal for people. It's part of sort of a necessary pain of going through a study like this. So we think it's very important that your leaders in the organization are able to answer questions and talk to employees about the scoring. So we take that really seriously, that they are prepared to do that. They're not going to get to come to us for a question, so they need to be able to talk to their supervisors and leadership about it. We use an ABDO. It's a proprietary methodology that we've used for over 10 years. It is consistent, or it aligns with the Minnesota pay methodology, so it's not the same, but when we get it into the pay equity, it's aligned, it's in compliance, it works in the state pay equity system. And it's really focused, as is any scoring methodology, so every consultant is gonna have their own math, basically, right? But they're all measuring the same things. And it's impact, it's overall impact on the organization. So we're looking at 4 key areas. Again, this is always the position, never the person. So if someone is overqualified for a position, that's not considered in the score. Neither is temporary assignments, or I'm the person who covers for the person above me if they're on vacation. Those temporary kinds of things are not considered in the score. So we're always looking, the first area is know-how. This is the most heavily weighted area, but it's not like grossly weighted. I should throw that in. So we're
Could
looking
you
at,
use an example with an actual number? I mean, what do you mean, have, like, is this 1 through 5, or
Oh, no.
10,
No,
or
great question.
100?
in a
or,
city
what-
your
yeah,
size,
what are you
it's
doing?
very possible that you'd have, under our methodology, it's very possible you'd have a range anywhere from, let's just say 90 to 700-800,
Okay.
okay? And the positions are gonna rank out, in there.
our current system, off the top of my head, if I'm remembering correctly, is roughly between 200 and maybe up to 850, 900.
Yep, yep. That's fine. The math is different, whichever sort of methodology you've been using, so it doesn't make them wrong. That's the other really important thing. These scores really only matter in the context of the Roseville organization.
Right.
So your police chief, whatever that score comes in at, there is no comparison if they go, to Savage and compare with that police chief score. Because they only sort of make sense within the context of your organization. Now, you're not gonna have, Roseville is 400 and Savage is 800. Like, that's not gonna happen, but the differences are, they don't matter necessarily if they're just reasonable differences, so. That's a big thing too. They'll call up their colleague at the city next door. What's your score?
Well, and, I'm sorry.
I was gonna say, so know-how would be, what, 40%, 30% of the total score? I mean, what's the breakdown with these?
I don't know off the top of my head.
I'm
That's
just
a
kinda
good question.
curious.
And it will vary a little bit too, based on the scope of the position, how heavily some of these are weighted compared to an entry-level position will have a physical effort, for example, will be a higher percentage of an entry-level position in Public Works, for example, than it would be for a city manager who is in the 800s. That physical effort will impact it significantly less. So it does vary. It's not necessarily 40 points available in this category, 40 in this category.
Right.
It's kind of exponential, if you will.
That's a bad answer, but it's kind
Yeah.
of tricky.
Well, yeah.
It just means it matters. A difference, maybe this is a better way to put it, a difference in know-how. So let's say you have a position that is associate's degree with 4 years of experience versus a bachelor's degree and 4 years of experience. That's a pretty significant score difference. But the difference in the score as a percentage of the total score is different based on the scores in the other areas, if that makes any sense. So it's just an area that if they over title, it's gonna make a difference in this area.
Well, because I guess where I was confused when you said the physical effect was bigger, so let's just use numbers again. So instead of having 50 in know-how, there's 50 in that one, so you're gonna end up with the same.
No.
See, that's where I'm confused when you say.
Usually
Yeah.
it is confusing. So for example, let's say we have an entry-level position with a less rigorous educational experience requirement. So there's a lower score in know-how, but it's a very physical position where they have to be on alert and they're in maybe they're going in confined spaces, whatever.
Right.
They're going to have a higher special conditions score,
Right.
which as a percentage of their total score, because their total score is lower, would be higher than, say, a senior level person with an office position has a low score in special conditions. It's a relatively small percentage of their total score.
So, and I'm going to jump in just a little bit because we've had to kind of figure this out on our side when we explain it, when we look at reclassification for different
Right.
positions. So the way we're currently doing it, which you can jump in if you have a different method.
Yep.
The way we're currently doing it is we have different criteria. I think it's 6, similar to these categories. And each one in that know-how is a matrix. And so it's if you have, for example, under know-how, if you have this amount of education on one side, and then the impact of your years of experiences across the top, you find where you're at, and there's a score. And we do that with each one, and then we add those scores, and those scores are weighted in each different category. So depending on where you add each category up gives you a total, and that total tells you where you fall in the pay plan. And so it's criteria within the criteria that gives you this scoring matrix.
Okay, that makes sense.
That's 100% accurate.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yes.
Yes, I was not answering the question. Each of these, we have 4 areas, and within these 4 areas is it's its own matrix.
Okay,
And that's, yes.
I get it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So under know-how, what are we talking about? We're talking about job-specific knowledge. How much, real-world experience in that job do they need to have? That's where your education might come in. The integrating know-how, we're talking about kind of the how much integration of what they know needs to happen. So are they mostly focused on a single sort of line of business or area focused, or are they in a role that is senior enough that they're trying to integrate unrelated functions and manage those types of things? So we're taking that into effect. Human relation skills, is it someone who's primarily doing data entry or analytical things, or is it, leadership in the police department who's negotiating a lot of conflict and interaction and leading others and those types of things. So that gets scored there. Problem solving takes into account, again, that context and precedent. Do they have, when they encounter a problem, do they know I choose from, is this a true-false question? Is this a multiple choice question where I have sort of 4 known responses, or is this a position where a lot of the problems are new and we're solving them in sort of an essay question kind of situation? And how hard are the complexity of the problems we're evaluating there, right? Accountability is not related to, we're all accountable to our job duties, but this is taking into consideration how much independent decision making do they have? What's that freedom to act independently? What's the budget, financial magnitude of the decisions that position is responsible for making? And then how direct or indirect is the impact of the decisions that they make within the organization?
Can I just interrupt you for a moment? Can we get the control room to put the PowerPoint back up on the large screen instead of the meeting video? Because thank you, because that helps us to follow who have to look this way as opposed to looking at that
Yes.
screen. So, thank you. Sorry to
Wonderful.
interrupt.
No, not at all, not at all. And then, again, special conditions, that's where positions are given credit for, physical effort required for the job, any environmental conditions if they're out in the elements, hazard exposure, sensory attention. I think of like a bus driver has to really be on alert, and so making sure that we're accounting for that.
I would think too, then that would fall into the Fair Labor Standards Act exempt versus not exempt, and whether or not an administrative person fell into the accountability role based on.
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely looking at the exempt, non-exempt on the job description side, but a lot of times the criteria that you evaluate on that exempt, non-exempt, they're very similar. So we're not giving extra points for an exempt classification, but the criteria measure a lot of the same things that are considered in that test as well. All right. Any questions on that one? Concerns? No. All right. So this is where we get to the part of the discussion where I just want to listen. And I'm also happy to kind of talk about what we've seen in other cities, some strategies that you might want to think through. But I think a really important, before we get any of the data, before we sort of put the cart before the horse, it's important to get some consensus or direction on, historically, the Roseville's placed itself or intended to position itself in that sort of right at average, right? Maybe slightly below, right at that average market position. Is that where you want to stay? And there's really no right or wrong answer. I think sometimes we'll work with cities and they'll feel like they sort of have to do something. There are strategic reasons to place yourself at a variety of different positions within the market range. So maybe just talk to me about that.
And I'm just going to, again, jump in one more time. And when you're thinking about that, also think about what that next bullet point is. What's the primary employee behavior to be motivated? Are you looking to really be that destination city? Do you want to focus on, there might be some positions that are okay with some turnover just by the nature of the position, and so you need to really attract people in. Are there some positions that, you know, as you're looking at the organization as a whole, that you really want to say, you know, look at this as a whole, and we want to make sure that, you know, we're going to have our workforce and not have a large turnover, or what does that all come into play when you're thinking about the philosophy and how you want to position yourself? So just thinking through all those different items.
Well, and I appreciate bringing up that nuance, because that's something that in the small compensation study I did for a nonprofit I was on the board of, I didn't do the study, I'm sorry, that was being done, that I was involved in. That was one of the questions that the consultant specifically asked, is you don't have to be the same in all different positions at all different levels of the organization. And so, you know, you can have your philosophy of maybe where you want to be on average, and then you may still have, you know, within your own organization, you know, places where there are a lot of positions where you're perfectly happy being sort of the entry level, people get some experience and then they move on. And it probably makes more of a difference in that regard the more you have sort of spread or range within a department, say, or within a group of positions, so that, you know, I can think of, if you've got an engineering organization, you definitely will have folks that are just coming right out of school.
Yep.
And they are doing a certain type of job and a certain, you know, role within the organization. Then as you move up into, you know, more experience and maybe more supervisory, you don't necessarily just want the person coming out of school to fill those. You want, you know, and so you may want to be more of a destination because you do want the longevity. You want somebody that's you know, that's going to be there for a while and maybe only has one more step in their career after you or something like that. And so I think it is important that we do think in those terms. I mean, it's obviously going to be maybe difficult for us on the city council to say, you know, here's where we should be in this position because we don't know all the detail. But to the extent that we can try to articulate where we want to be in some of those variety of different areas, that's where I sort of would try to come from on it. And I don't necessarily have the answer, but Councilmember Hatton?
Yeah, as you guys talk about this, I say, are we going to be looking at each position description and say where's the range? And I think we better not be doing that, right?
We're not, no.
But
We better not be doing that, yeah,
Yes.
as the policy-making board, right, yes.
And I was here through the pain of the last compensation study, and we arrived at this, what looks in this discussion a bit peculiar, 97 to 100% of average. So is a range like 95 to 105 better because it allows for some of that nuance that then the administrative staff can say, hey, these are some of these positions that would work better at 95%, but here are positions we want to make sure we're sitting at that 105%. Is that more of the kind of range discussion we should be thinking about and philosophy?
Great questions. So, a couple things to sort of consider. One important thing to remember is that you're 100% right. We don't, because of the Minnesota pay equity rules, you're not going to get to position each role respective to the market. They're going to have to be graded so that similarly scored positions are paid similarly with respect to the market, right? So the market's always considered. But, you know, if you have, where we see challenges right now would be if you have, let's say, a very high demand IT position where there's a big supply shortage in the market for that position. If it's scored similarly to another position, it's scored similarly, but there's more of those people, and so the market is lower. Someone's either going to be paid above the market or below the market. And so it's, when you're looking at position, you're not looking, when you're looking at the city's desired position within the market, we're not looking by work position, we're looking at on a whole. If we sort of average out those variances, where would you like to put yourself? Do you want to be sort of closer to the average, and what does that mean for recruiting, retention? We can talk through all of those things. Is it, you know, you choose to be more of a destination city, which then in a lot of cases means, if that's sort of the goal, I would say you likely want to consider having your sort of step one, your entry the minimum range or the minimum pay, you may want that to be above the market average because you're trying to attract talent from somewhere else, and you may need to be a little more competitive than the market to get them in the door without having to negotiate them at step 4 just to get them in. So I'll see cities say, we're comfortable with maybe having our minimum pay at the, let's say, 20%, or excuse me, 80% of market. Okay, so that's, if 100% is average, no, I'm getting this wrong.
120.
Let's call average 50% of market. Just, I have a visual for this, but.
Our entry is 85% of the top, so if that
Okay.
makes, and
Yeah, so if let's say you're middle, if you're average, you may wanna say, we want our minimum pay to be in sort of that upper quartile, above the average, so we can get them in the door at a step 1 without having to negotiate them mid-range, just to get them in. But maybe your max pay is a lot closer to the average, right? Because again, we're looking at a range of pay, not just a single data point. That may be the case. Some cities say we can get them in the door, because we just know our area, and the recruiting part isn't a challenge, but like a stepping stone community, they may say retention is our biggest challenge, so we can have our starting pay be more in line with the market average starting pay, but we need our top end pay to be higher or they leave. They hit the top step and they leave. So maybe our top end pay needs to be, in the upper quartile as it relates to the market. There's a lot of things you can play with there, and so it's really understanding what's most important to you.
I was wondering if you took into consideration turnover rates or vacancy rates when you're making those decisions as well.
Yeah.
And I think what it comes down to me is, of course, we want to be competitive and all that, but then there's if we're saying a 20% increase in our entry-level rate, that is a humongous budget
Keep in mind,
impact.
if you said we would like to be, so let's say you're average, and let's say, there's average, and you said we would want to be at that sort of upper quartile. So that's not 25% in pay increases. It means if the range is $10 an hour, if you've got a 10% range, so the position is $20 to $30 an hour, I'm just completely making up numbers. You're saying it's usually only a couple of dollars. I'm not explaining this well.
So if the range is 20 to 30,
Your position is different than
right.
the increase in budget.
so for example, if you have that $20 to $30 range for a position, and the starting pay is 20, the average is 25, and the above average market is 30. Instead of starting them at, say, $19 an hour, and you want to start them closer to average, you would be at the 23, 24 piece, but you're looking at the range as a whole. So when you're starting somebody, it's a little bit different. It's not the full $10 increase for your budget. It would just be the increase from where you're currently at to a little bit higher to the average.
What's our turnover rate now?
So it's increased over the last few years. So we had been holding steady right around 9.5% which is average for a government industry based on what I know. Last year, and this does not include our IT group, which
Good.
pulled out, we were at over a 13% turnover rate. So in addition.
Just to clarify, is that non-IT and non-IT?
No,
both
so
cases?
it wasn't. So
Okay,
it was,
that's- yeah.
we had turnover with IT included, but then when we pulled them out, we still had a higher IT, or a higher turnover rate. In addition to that, the other piece that.
That's full-time people.
Yes, this is only for our benefit eligible, so we do have 3/4 time also.
Okay.
But the other thing to consider is what we're seeing in the market with recruiting is we're seeing anywhere from 40 to 60% fewer applicants for most of our positions. So when we have that turnover rate, we're seeing fewer applicants apply for each of these positions. So sometimes anecdotally, it's more difficult, as we all know, to hire. So.
Okay, So all this brings me back to what on earth are we setting? Because we start talking about, well, for these positions, they might have higher turnover, we should be thinking about this.
Yep.
And for this thing, but yet we're not supposed to do, so what are we supposed to do?
If I could.
What is being asked?
Well, yeah,
If I could
because
jump in.
we keep going back into the
Right,
weeds
right.
where the
Yeah.
city council isn't supposed to be and saying, well, we might want to make all of these positions, we don't know what they are at a certain level and set the level differently over here, and then suddenly we're making decisions we shouldn't.
It seems to me from being not with this background that what we're talking about is what do we want to be as an organization in our pay philosophy for the overall market, not look at the individual ones. And I think we have to be careful when we say 100, if we say 100%, okay? We always talk around that number, 100%. I have to remind myself, and this might be apparent to everybody here at the table, but that doesn't mean maximum.
Right, that's 100% of
Average. So there's people that are paid higher, or cities that pay higher and pay lower. We're just in the middle, right? So if we have to land on a number, whatever that number would be, and then from there, once you set that system, if that's 98%, if that's 102%, then you have an idea, then within the compensation plan, you would make decisions and saying, we want to start instead of at 85%, at maybe at a higher rate because we want to attract people. I think those are decisions made within that overarching system. And yes, it does have budgetary impact. You might be spending some dollars sooner, but once again, it depends on where people are on the steps. As you know, people, when they start usually at the bottom. Lately, they haven't because we can't be competitive. We have to start more in the middle. Then they eventually max out. And then when that person leaves, that person, it starts again here. So I think what we're trying to do is trying to have the overarching philosophy. What's the goal we want to try to hit? Do we want to be at 100% average? Do we want to be above average for all of our positions, or slightly below average? And then I think that can help inform us into the next steps and how we start looking at individual jobs and might say we need to be more competitive at the starting rate for these positions because these are hard to get. These might be entry level. We want to be destination, and still, have a maximum range that we're not going to necessarily increase. It's just what we do within that range and where we start people. That makes sense.
But the you is going to be you, deciding where in these job categories we want to.
Well,
Like let's say we set 100% of average. Question again, how deep this group of 5 people get. Are we going to be saying, well, these 12 categories we really should be, right? So we're just being asked for a small range of where we want to target for the overall picture.
Exactly.
So
Well,
most of the rest of this is good to know about, but not.
And what's
part
our
of
time
discussion.
frame that we're kind of looking at too? Because I could say, oh, this is a really tight job market. We should try to aim to be 110% of average. But then suddenly, 3 years from now, the whole marketplace is different. But we're still shooting to be 110% of average.
Right, and you don't need
How
us.
do we
Yeah.
how do we make this policy decision or this policy recommendation meaningful or timely in terms of what we're trying to do in the marketplace? And it almost seems to me that you can't. I don't want to say I'm giving up, but I mean, it just seems to me we're trying to be too clever for our own good, maybe.
Yeah.
Just a quick thought on that is, when you think about, to Councilmember Etten's point about just kind of the big, small picture, if that made sense.
The big, small.
The big, small picture of
Okay.
what we're looking for is, competitiveness, position in the market, that type of thing. Our compensation system is one structure. And so when you say we want to be 100% of the average, that's where our consultants come in and say, okay, that's what it looks like for these positions. But to Mayor Rowe's question about how do we maintain that, that gets to those maintaining the marketable wages into the future, whether, and you jump in here, Leah, but whether that's through COLAs, whether it's through some sort of merit something or other, but those are additional questions on how to maintain it. So.
Yeah, you've been doing a good job maintaining your existing study and structure for a long time, but the market's more volatile than it's been in a while. So to your question of, well, what if we set it at something today, and I mean, everybody's talking recession, and how do we sort of adjust more frequently than you have historically? And I think that's an important thing to consider. We're having a lot of cities say, we're doing the study today. We're going to sort of monitor COLAs in our comparable group, but we anticipate that we're gonna need a full market study, not a full compensation study, but just a more detailed survey more frequently as you move forward, so that that can really guide based on your philosophy about where do you want to be in the market. It can guide that, well, what should our COLA be this year? Maybe we did a really big one last year and the market has stood still, and that can sort of inform your COLA discussions year over year. A lot of times the movement within the range stays what it, if you're saying it's 3% from step to step to step, that doesn't change year over year, but it can really inform, well, how much does the whole range need to move from a cost of living perspective year over year? And that can keep you right-sized with the market.
Is the better policy guidance to say we want to be plus or minus something around average as an organization?
Well,
rather
keep
than,
in mind-
because I mean, we're saying 90, I guess 97 to 100 is, in a sense, the
Plus
minus.
The minus.
But, I don't know. I'm just trying to make sure what we do is meaningful. It would seem to me that if you're always targeting yourself to be some point in, relative to average in the marketplace is doing the moving.
Yes.
And so that's where measuring more frequently tells you where you are. But to me, if you're asking us to make a policy decision for like the long term, irrespective of the market, then, it seems to me, where do we want to be relative to average? And then the market, and then we have to have that conversation about how often do we measure the market to make sure that we're,
Yes.
that we're there.
And I would say that that's a good way to put it. I think we need to deal with what's in front of us now and then have more frequent conversations about the market. When we did the last wage adjustment in 2013, we were at about 95.4%, and the study called for a 4.6 increase. In the end, a 3.26 or something like that was approved. So that got us a little bit past 98% at that time, 10 years ago. I would suspect we're probably lower than that now. I don't know. We'll see what the study comes back. But I think we need to maybe focus on the here and now and what do we need to do today, relatively speaking, and adjust to get to a spot where we are competitive and we're not at a disadvantage. And don't know what that number exactly is, but if we wanted to be kind of average, that would be the 100%. And then in the future, you would have to look at, okay, what's the market doing? Or, did we over-adjust, or are we caught up to it now? And now these are just little minor increments. We can go several years without making an adjustment, what have you. But we do, I think, have something that we need to solve for today, relatively speaking, and that we need to at least be competitive in today's world. Not disregarding the future, because I think that's really important as well, but I think we have a lot of catch-up to do.
And this is just non-union people we're putting this range on,
Yes.
so, okay.
But the reality is that with unions, you're looking at
Well,
100%.
and but that's the other piece, is sometimes what you
in there,
negotiate with the union affects then what we're
Right.
doing on
Well,
non-union
yeah, but see, with
too,
unions,
so.
there's extra motivation to get to 100% because you get arbitration going on if you're not doing things that are equal. So usually our unions are at 100%, while the non-union employees are less, on average. So.
And that's
there's-
something to consider, is that what we want to continue to do, is, yeah,
Yes, you could.
right.
Well, we have had a philosophy before, unofficial or official, depending on how you look at it, that was to try to make sure that non-organized employees were also at the same average, same relative to average as the organized employees.
Right,
I
because
think-
sometimes that can get out of whack and cause issues.
quickly.
The
yeah.
other
Yes.
piece of the negotiation process, of course, with organized employees is that you negotiate your comparables too. And so,
Yep.
that can help to sort of artificially skew things depending on what ultimately gets negotiated as to what you're saying you're 100% of,
Yep.
as compared to a more general market study out there that may put you in a different place. So there's just a lot of moving pieces to it. But,
Yes.
it would seem that if our philosophy has been to try to be at average, that we still want to be there. I don't know that anybody's going to say we should go down to 75% of average, or we should go up to 125% of average necessarily, as a overall long-range philosophy.
Right.
But I don't know that 97 to 100. I don't know what that really tells us necessarily. Maybe we're putting too fine a point on it.
I just have a question about COLA. Is a COLA guaranteed for all employees?
It's always subject to budget approval. In unions, it is negotiated in the contract.
So it's only guaranteed to the extent that it's in the contract.
Other folks, if it gets too...
Non-union, so we've had years where we've had 0, very low, lower than what we see in the market. And other times we try to match the market. Sometimes we look at what the unions are getting. Sometimes we have a current policy based on CPI and employee cost index, so it's varied over the years, but there's no guarantee.
So the top of the job scale isn't necessarily the top, though. If you make $30 an hour, but you've been here a bunch of years, you could be making 34 B.
Still eligible for
Because-
COLA,
Yeah.
Right.
as approved, yeah.
And once again, this might be apparent to everybody, but the COLA is really meant to adjust for rising costs, to adjust for inflation. Inflation never was a word that we used much until the last couple of years again. So that's something that's really relevant, more so today than it has been.
So to think about the COLA, if you have a compensation where the top is $30 in a position, the entire structure, if you have a 3% COLA, shifts 3%. So then that range maintains that range. But yes, when the compensation system was started in whatever year it was, that range adjusts based on those COLAs.
And the employee maintains its relative position within that range. So if you're at the max, then you are at the max after the adjustment. If you're at the middle, you stay in the middle. And where you have your merit or longevity increases, that's when you would move up your position within the range. So COLA is about the structure, increases within is about the individual employees.
So I had 2 other questions. One was, we didn't really talk about banding. So as far as getting wage bands, so that you could do laterals, or, if you were out on disability or whatever, you knew what a lateral was, you could do in a non-labor position. So we didn't really talk about that, and I think that's an important part of the compensation study, and I'm sure part of what you expect, but I'm not sure how you
How that works.
set that up. Yeah. And then I guess the other thing is, it's really hard for people who've never gotten COLAs to understand and appreciate that it's kind of a given, or that it feels like, no fair. 'Cause we have a lot of employees in our city as taxpayers who maybe have never gotten a COLA, or, worked for the same pay for a really long time. So I truly want to do right by our employees, but it's really hard to think that maybe many people in our city make far less, or have far less benefits. And so we have to make sure that we're not pricing some of our seniors out of their homes, and we're not making it impossible for people to do, just life, because it's a balancing act. So I get wanting to go up to a certain range, but I also really like to see the dollar amount before I make
Oh, gosh, yes. And keep in mind, we will just use your sort of feedback as a guide to design a recommended plan that you'll have all the budgetary information, if adopted, this is the budget impact. So it's more just an idea of, where would you like us to take it and bring back to you. So one thing too, I would say too, you are in a unique, and I don't have a horse in this race, so hopefully this is just a good sort of independent comment, but you are in a unique market. There are talent shortages. I think those are all things to be very aware of.
Pretty much across all industries, all positions.
And segments.
Yes.
Minnesota is uniquely positioned, and even through COVID, there were a lot of, Minnesota overall was still barely above full employment from an unemployment perspective, but for a short period of time during the worst of COVID. So there aren't enough people to fill positions in Minnesota right now. And so I think it's just really important for employers to say, because there is nothing wrong with saying our goal is to be at that 100% average, but make sure you know what is your competitive advantage then. Because if the straight comp is average, you need to really double down on whatever else it is that's going to be the draw. So it might be culture, it might be benefits, it might be, I mean, it might be the community. So there's a lot of things to keep in mind, but make sure you know what it is, because you're going to really need to leverage that. If the position will be average for pay, then what is the draw on those other criteria?
I think looking at this from a more higher philosophical level, when I was thinking about this meeting tonight, I was thinking, what makes people want to come to work? I don't want people just to come to work to slog through the day. I want to make sure that they're here because they want to be here, and part of that is pay, but part of it's also the culture and that it's a pleasant place to work. Part of it's a shorter commute than some other jobs. If you're going to drive an hour compared to 10 minutes, it makes a difference to people. But I do think we have to up that above that. My guess would, maybe it's 95 to 100, maybe it's 97 to 103, but I think we have to have something over that average mark so that there's some flexibility. I've been going through this with another nonprofit I'm on the board of, and we've had to readjust everything this year, and it's making all the difference in the world. We're getting good applicants. We're getting all the positions filled that we had empty. So I think we have to give those tools to administration in order to do this. So those are just my thoughts on what the discussion is. I'm not sure I have the exact answer, and like Councilmember Strawn says, of course we have to be very careful about spending the taxpayers' money, because many of them are on fixed incomes, or they have not had cost of living increases in their jobs. You know, there are people like that too. So until we had a final number, I wouldn't say, yeah, this is where we're going, but that's my general response to what you're talking about tonight.
And it ought to be fairly easy to figure out. If we say, our target is 100% of average, just to say that's what it is, and you come back and that gives us a system, and we reset everything, and then now that comes up with a budget number for full implementation, we do have the option to say, as we consider this public dollars and the impact on taxpayers and ratepayers, all right, implementation at 100% is this. We could implement and self-decide to implement at a higher percentage or a lower percentage.
Yeah.
We still have that option, I would think, as we consider the dollar impacts. We just have to know in the marketplace, ultimately, if we decide to implement at 89% instead of 100% of average, it's going to have an impact on our ability to attract people to those jobs. I still am not sure that we need to position ourselves necessarily too much above average, only because I don't know how tight the range is about that average either in terms of the marketplace out there. And the fact that if we measure the marketplace often enough, the average is going to move to hopefully reflect that, and then we can still be in a pretty good position to attract people. And I don't know for sure that at this 100% theoretical target that we've been in a really bad position over time. If we have, we can talk about that, but I guess, we haven't even been at 100 in all cases necessarily either.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, as far as I can see, dating back to 2002, we have not been at 100%. In 2002, the council at the time pegged it at 97%. And they had this merit pay, not to get way into the weeds here, and that was to based on performance for people to earn more, up to 115% to do that. The problem was it was never fully implemented, especially with dollars behind it to make that actually happen.
Sure.
Yeah.
We have a paltry amount of $35,000 that we do, which is, I'm not saying it's a small chunk of change, but you look at the organization and a $50-60 million budget, it doesn't get you very far in doing that. So it was never properly implemented. We talked about that in 2013 as well, and we've kept the same system. And so we moved up to about 98%. So if we're at 100%, that was probably really long time.
I think maybe what makes sense is to look at what the recommendation is at our current policy, and then we can make a decision on the policy. I just don't, I don't want to say, oh yeah, we should be targeting, obviously we can pick any number we want, because it's going to be designed around that, and then we just have to respond to that, I guess, and say, oh, well, that was the wrong number, for budgetary reasons. That's about all we can do. I don't know what else What else we can.
If I could say, I think, when we're starting to focus on the numbers and we're maybe getting scared of what those numbers are going to look like, I think if we can identify what we want to be as an organization and what we want to do, as you said, we can look at options when we get down to implementation. But let's just say we were to say 100%, we might want to be average. We get those results, then we can talk around that. Okay, maybe we can't be that now in the end, or maybe we can, or maybe we can't be that right now, but we can get there over a series of years. But what we're trying to do is, okay, what's the basic core philosophy that we have as a city? I'm not saying the costs will sort themselves out, because they could be pretty major, and we'll have to have that reality check. But there's ways you can implement them or change course a little bit. But I think if we set, we're going to come back at 98%, for instance, that's our current philosophy, then that's going to be the baseline. Then anything more is going to be that much harder to implement. I think by looking at 100%, you can say, okay, here's where we are on average, and then you can make the conversation around whether we should be higher or lower, and then also look at, more importantly, the implementation. And what's the cost, and
Right.
how can we do that? And we don't have that data yet. We'll get that at some point. But we just don't want to come back and say, well, we 100%. And you say, what are you doing? That's crazy. We don't want to do that. We want to have some consensus on what we bring back, so at least we can have a productive discussion. Not that it's going to stay at 100%, because there's still the reality check. But so in other words, if we were to bring back 100%, is that a good starting point? And then from there, you guys can have the conversation around higher or lower implementation.
Council, what do you think? Any objection to coming in with the 100% to start with?
Well, I would think you'd want to come in at where the policy is now, because that's an easier comparison, because that way that's your starting point, with the idea that more than likely we are going to have to go up. But for me, might be, I have a feeling the number's going to be quite large, even staying at the current policy.
That's the question, yeah.
And so I guess I'd like to see, okay, if we left it where it is, what would it look like? Thinking we still may need to go to 100, so here's where we are, and here it is at 100. So I'd like to see actually both, because I do think we're going to end up having to go to 100 with the market. But I for comparative, I guess I'd like to see what the increase is going to be, keeping our current philosophy.
Well, so our policy officially, I think you're saying, is 97 to 100.
Right, and now they're at 98
Where
is
are
the
we
average.
actually at is a whole other
I thought
thing.
he said 98.
When we in 2013, when we made the council made the final decision, with that adjustment, we were at 98.6%, is my math. That's where we ended up. Whether that's a stated policy, I don't think the council said this is the policy at 98.6, but that's where we
That's
made
where
the
we
decision.
ended up, right? We didn't, that was a one-time decision, not a policy decision, right?
Yes, yeah.
Yes, so we're talking strategy, right? So it's not how much are you going to approve when we bring it to you, it's just big picture. In a perfect world, if you could wave a magic wand and position yourself in the market, where would you like to be? And then what we can do is bring you, this is what that would look like. Here's some ways you could phase that in if it's really impactful. Or here's, maybe you want to see 98%, 100%, and 102%.
Right.
And you can see what the phase-ins might look like.
Right.
Yeah.
Because I think you'll be surprised, 102% isn't going to be as much more than 100 or 98% than you think.
That
And
would
then
be really helpful.
maybe we need to look at,
Well, that's what
I
I,
mean,
yes.
the thing
right,
that's
what I'm
more than
getting
that, you
at.
know?
I still, but again, I know even though we still have to be concerned about what the budgetary effect is going to be, so that's
Yep.
why it'd be good to see, all right, if you left your policy as it is, using the market data, this is what it is. I mean, that's what I'd like to see for comparative.
But 98, 100, 102 would actually essentially show that.
It would give us the
I think
range.
that would-
And that's what I'm
It'll give you
saying, yeah.
the better picture.
But is your
of-
point, Mayor, that we should look at 95, 100, and 105, or something like that, so we see a better breadth of,
well, I guess it kind of depends on what not very much difference means, because I can agree, yeah, 98 versus 100 isn't that much different,
What's our annual
But- $1 million.
payroll?
Yeah.
What's our
Right,
annual payroll?
that's where it enters into it, right,
Yeah,
So, I
20
mean,
million or something.
20 million
Right.
is our annual payroll?
right. So 2% of that,
That's a
plus or
lot.
minus.
Yeah,
Be a
and
lot.
the implementation cost is a little bit nuanced, right? Because okay, so we usually use this analogy of moving in a house. So you've got a step in, there's grades and there's steps within each grade. Today, your people are on a step. They're in a house and they're on a step. We're gonna bring back a step and grade that's totally different. It's an entirely separate house. There's two things that you need to consider. One is to implement, almost always, they're gonna move to the step in their respective grade that's closest to their current rate of pay without going backwards. So if your range moves up quite a bit, someone might be on a step 5 right now, but in the new house, their closest step, the step closest to their current rate of pay without going backward might be a step 2. Okay?
So they've just gained a couple of steps or 3 steps.
They now have step opportunity that they didn't have before, but that's not an incremental 2% increase. They may go, one person may go up 50 cents, one person may go up, it just depends on how, right? So it's just not a 2% of total labor budget kind of analysis.
And it does change every single year. Not everybody's going up the same steps. Everybody's at different steps. You're maxed out, they leave, they start over. People are at different steps.
Yeah.
So every year it's a different number, you know,
Yeah.
on what it is. It's depending on the workforce makeup, so.
Awesome.
Yeah, so
Really
it's
easy
very
to figure
good. The good news is though, like you can kind of say, here's our ideal as a whole. If we could average everybody out, ideally we'd like to be here in the market. We can build a phase-in program that will meet your budget no matter sort of where that is. And so I do think, don't worry too much about the budget because we can always move that back, phase it out over time, make adjustments. But in a perfect world, where would you like to be? And think about it both at the start step and the top step. They may be different. You may say we want to be in this position. So anyway, I'm hearing, this is what I'm going to bring back. I'm going to bring you 98, 100, and 102, and that can be the start of the conversation. How does that
Yeah,
sound?
sounds good.
Well, you just threw a wrench in at
just
the end
open a new door.
with the notion
I
of
know
where
everyone was like,
Will you start?
dang, the meeting was over.
So
Where
if I understood your point, and the last point is if this is average in the marketplace, we can decide where our range is from our lowest to our min to max. So we could set our min closer to average and our max closer to higher, more above
Exactly.
average versus just right in the middle.
Exactly, and
Okay.
there's reasons to do that. There's different reasons.
Yeah.
Are you struggling to attract, but because you're a destination city, retention's not your biggest concern? Or is it the inverse of that?
Answer that question for us, staff.
Depends on the position.
Yeah.
It really
But
does.
as an organization, because we're being forced to
Yeah,
think
no,
of it that
right.
way too.
It's very hard, isn't it? Yeah, it's hard to generalize across things.
We
I
want
think
them to stay right until just before retirement and then go somewhere.
Finish
No.
the 2 years somewhere else.
No, not really, but,
I think generally
financially.
we would like to be, a destination even for lower level positions. We want it to be a good position, understanding we have limited positions. If people want to advance in their career, they often have to go somewhere else because we only have so many positions that you can do. But I think overall we want to be a destination, a desirable place to come, even if it's a lower level, because of the culture, because of the community, because of the work. That's my philosophy, at least.
Culture, community, and work as measured by compensation?
No, not
Or
necessarily.
in addition
No.
to compensation?
No, it's part of that.
Yeah, because we're being asked to talk about compensation in this part of it.
Yeah.
So,
But also as a council, we have a goal of not having did you say 13%? We don't want to have that many jobs empty. We don't have that.
turnover.
That doesn't help. You
turnover.
have to train people. There's cost to that too.
Which, based on our rough numbers from our partners, it is just over $4,000 to fill
Yeah.
a position.
Right.
So, just in.
Things to weigh.
You're lucky.
Yeah, if you're lucky. Depending on the position, it's more expensive in certain positions, but
But I'm happy with the numbers you said, 98, 100, and 102. It'll give us more information to have a further discussion.
and that's just
my-
assuming that our range is centered on average.
would you say?
What we will do is we'll position your min and your max step,
Both at 100%.
98, 100, 102.
Got it, okay.
Yep.
That clears it up.
But you will have the ability to think through that if we need to. When we come with the recommendations, I will say, it's not ideal to then just start like monkeying with the numbers, right? We could spend the rest of our lives sort of messing with that. But I think as long as you're saying, okay, this is the data we want to see, and if you think that's going to meet the needs from a recruiting and retention perspective. The other thing I'll add is we have cities that say we need to be at the top of the market, and they still can't get people because culture is a problem, right? So, play to your
And that's
strengths.
usually the fault of the 5 people sitting on our side of the
Yep.
table.
Play to your
Well, it's kind of
strengths, but that would be my comment, would just be, make sure that wherever you, when you're thinking about it, as we come to that meeting and you get that data, make sure you understand, if we say we're gonna be here, then what's the tactic on the other ways to recruit and retain?
I did want to touch on a couple of things. One was the performance-based, which was dealt with a little bit in 2013, although not funded. I think the challenge in the conversations we've had about that in the past, both from a staff and a council perspective, is as a public sector employer, how do you deal with the two things that are sometimes a factor in that, which is internal equity and the perception of, well, it wasn't fair that so-and-so got performance pay. I don't think they deserved it, or what, so there's that side of it. And then there's the perception with, on the part of the tax and ratepayers of, is that an appropriate use of public funds to reward somebody in the public sector? And so I think the challenge, so it was just easier to sort of not deal with it at that point. So I think that's a legitimate question that we still are going to be struggling with, and I don't think we have the answer. We don't have to have the answer tonight, just so you know. But then the other piece of it was the comment about longevity pay, and I don't think we do anything along those lines.
Not for non-union.
Except for union contracts.
Right, okay. So it'd be interesting to see what a model might look like if we applied that, on the non-union side of things. I'm imagining it, because I'm somewhat visual in that sense, I'm thinking your steps are like this, and then your longevity is a much flatter curve or something like that, so that maybe you have longer, less steep steps going forward if you stay in the same, job for 20 years or something like that. That, you're not just getting COLAs necessarily. Because of your longevity, you're becoming more valuable to the organization. So you're doing baby steps over a longer period of time or something along those lines.
I would say, so there are 100 different variations on performance pay, exceptional service pay, longevity pay, and my recommendation would be to identify the challenge you're trying to solve first before you start looking at scenarios, because you can sort of build in things that are addressing things that aren't actually an issue. So, like, I would say, let's have a longevity pay conversation if I'm hearing you say people top out too soon and then they leave because they don't have anywhere else to go.
And we may need to hear that from.
I mean, those are I think we gotta get clear on what's your goal? What behavior are you trying to motivate? Is it staying? Is it development? Longevity pay is not tied to performance. Is that what you actually want? Do you want people being paid above the range without a performance component? So there's a lot of things to be thinking about in that. And those are things you can bolt on to a comp model later if you don't have the answers to that today.
The other thing to think about with longevity pay is the impact it has on pay equity.
Yeah, true enough, yeah. Well, like I said, I was just raising it because it was the first time that I think that's been part of our conversation, and I think that's an excellent point, that you don't want to be sort of implementing something if you don't know what the problem is that you're trying to solve. And so I think we as an organization need to have more conversations along those lines to see, whether the current pseudo incentive system is really working, or if it, or what is it supposed to be doing, and is it actually doing that? And if we want to do something different, I think we need to have those conversations, and I'm glad it can bolt on, because nobody at 1 hour over our allotted time is ready to have those conversations tonight.
Sorry.
No, that's not, it's our fault.
And I think a good place to start trying to identify is, and you probably have all of this, Rebecca, but do you have an understanding of what's driving turnover? Do you have an understanding of what's driving offer turn downs, if those are happening? Is it comp? Is it something else? So figure out what that barrier is first, because there's all kinds of things we can do in that comp plan design to help get at those things, but we have to be clear about what they are. and they're different in every city, so.
I feel like some of it's relocation expense, because we've had some international employees who've been offered and turned down, so I wonder if that's some of it. I just wanted to mention that performance-based merit or increases are not really best practice at this point, especially from a DEI impact. And so, especially because of the subjective rating scales, someone might have inherent bias and not rate up someone who, for whatever reason, they just aren't inclined to give them a good review. So I would be inclined to say that they should be separate from the performance reviews, shouldn't be connected to pay. And I think it makes it a little bit easier. But it definitely, I think we continue to struggle with our DEI impact. And so I think that would be really good to take it out of there, at least at this point, or not consider adding it. Plus $35,000 in an organization of this size really isn't going to, unless, you
So
know.
we haven't had a performance
Yeah,
system, really.
yeah, but as far as why it maybe would just not go toward
And I
that.
think those are exactly the reasons why it wasn't really
Yeah.
put into place at that time.
Yeah, but there's just really not been good, I mean, I train supervisors all day long on how to do performance reviews, and it doesn't seem to have a humongous, it's not a measurable effect on how much I can move that scale of them understanding what rating bias indicates. So I think it's just better to move it away from there, or not go into that realm in my mind.
If we identify the problem, solve it in a better way, more effective way that actually does the job.
All right.
Yep. All right. Anything else that we haven't covered, or any input that you need to still receive?
No, I think we have good marching orders, and you have our contact information in the slides here, so if something comes up, and we'll just continue to work with your leadership team, and just know behind the scenes we're meeting with leadership and making sure everybody's kind of aware and keeping them informed. A lot of times that's a challenge, is people don't feel like they've been involved when they should be, so
All right.
we'll keep you
Great.
posted.
Thank
Thanks
you.
again.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm glad we allocated the time for this. Well, if there's nothing else on our agenda, I don't know that we're really doing a future agenda review and things like that this evening, unless you've got it.
I
Mr.
have it, I'll
Treasurer.
pull up real quick.
Okay.
I'll be really, really brief. Fight each other.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
I just want to mention our next meeting. I send an email at the end of the business day, so you may not have seen it, but the last bullet point, consider a request by Prince of Peace to extend their state of enforcement regarding the presence of residential micro units on their property. Staff has been meeting with them a few times, and came up with a framework where they would be applying for an interim use. That process is just beginning. They have applied to host a community open house, and they're asking for an extension of the stay of enforcement until July 30th to allow for the interim use process to go forward. So that's all in front of you, is just whether or not, as the Board of Adjustment and Appeals, because that's what you made the decision on, to extend that period of time to give them an opportunity to pursue a land use option in front of the council with, no guarantee, but that process needs to play out. So that's going to be coming in front of you. There's some supporting material I sent with it and some other explanation in my email, so you can take a look at that. And feel free to give me a call if you have any
Well, I'm
questions.
going to want a legal read on some of that too,
Well,
when we do it.
Yeah, I was just going to say, this is just an update on
Right,
that it will
right,
be on
right.
the agenda, yeah.
But I mean, as a part of that, when it comes up, it'd be nice. Yeah.
Doubtless, the legal aspect has been part of the process.
The legal aspect has very much been part of the process, but I'm trying to decide how to say this. We may need to have a closed session, to really have an open, candid conversation about litigation risk, which is what we're, I would assume they'll threaten to sue us again. And if that happens, depending on the action that you're considering, I may recommend a layover so that we can have an open, candid conversation.
Much of
about,
that will be sorted between now and next Monday.
Right, but I mean, if we start heading toward, we meaning you, start heading toward a direction that raises some concern for me, I'm not gonna make a record of what I think your litigation risk is. What I will recommend is, let's have a closed session conversation about this. Just
Stay tuned is
To
what
tee
I
that
hear.
up with an empty room.
Right, no, that's why I wanted to
Plus all the
make
people
sure-
watching on the cameras.
Right.
Yeah, no, that's why I
Yes.
wanted to make sure that was involved.
And then speaking of closed session, we are planning going to closed session for my performance review. We're all set to go.
On the 24th.
Considering that, do we want to look at May 8th for you?
That could work just
I
fine.
was pushing him earlier because I wanted to get his thing in, but there's some
Yep.
big things on the 24th, and so I think it might make more sense to put your review to May 8th.
We can do that.
And depending on the 24th goes, well, no, no.
Yeah, no, that's
I
fine.
think that
Okay.
makes more sense, considering what's,
Yep.
the list here,
balance it.
there are a number of items that could take a little more time.
Works.
Okay. Anything else on the future agenda? I concur with that observation.
Yeah, because that's going to be a long meeting.
I'd be willing to push the engagement to
Yep.
the 8th as well.
Sure.
Just so that there's adequate time, because there's been some meeting controversies getting connections to some of the right people.
Okay.
So I'd be willing to wait until the 8th if that, because it does look like we have a pretty significant, potentially pretty significant on the 24th.
Okay.
So I'm willing
Thank
to
you.
make that
Thank you.
change.
All right. If nothing else on the future agenda, any council member communications, announcements, reports, requested agenda items for future meetings?
Wednesday night is the Board of
Metro Cities.
Metro Cities event at the Oval at 5 p.m.
Right. All right. If there's nothing else, the only thing left on our agenda is a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Councilmember Strawn, second by Councilmember Schroeder, in a reversal of the approval of the agenda earlier this evening. No discussion on a motion to adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That passes unanimously, and we are adjourned at 8:01 p.m. Thanks, everyone.
Woo-hoo.